Lalo,
Yo,
you just got out of a Bolt meeting talking about specs. We're talking
yeah.
about uh, how you get things implemented in Bitcoin. It's very hot topic right now. And you were just describing what was it? The Trinity.
Yeah, like the Holy Trinity or like the Triumvirate,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically like developers, miners, and then users, right? And I think depending, like, because like, obviously the CTV going on right now, I think there's kind of like a bigger meta discussion basically of like how things are done in the first place, right? I feel like some individuals don't want to define how things are done because they feel like the system is better to be a little bit murky, basically, and not necessarily give a blueprint. Maybe that's fine. It's kind of like a more rough thing. People are saying, okay, well, in times of a crisis or maybe kind of like some sort of existential evolutionary thing. Maybe like regulation to get too crazy. We need better tools on chain. Maybe we should have like a framework, right? I think some framework that I think people. I know Rusty wrote a blog post in the past. I think Ryan Gentry and also Buck have also written about this kind of like this model of okay, well, what exactly are the roles, right? So it's something like the developers basically propose. They write the code, they do due diligence basically. They make sure things aren't going to be super crazy at all, right, at that point, right. You can say miners like ratify as in okay, they say okay, everyone else is good, let's kind of like stamp the thing and put it in. And they say users basically have the control to basically like veto or reject it, right. I feel like certain individuals maybe like couple the user. I guess the other thing is the user is somewhat a problematic category because like okay, well, who's a user? Miners also
Mm-hmm.
a user, developer users, kind of like that. How do you actually capture economic users as well too? And also like how do you acknowledge that like many Bitcoin users don't even know this discussion is happening right now, at all, right? And
Mm-hmm.
maybe they're depending on it for their livelihood around the world. Basically, they're actually using it, day to day. So exactly how do you define that itself, right? I think right now some discussion is kind of like, assuming that developers have a role in ratification, basically, right? And that being okay, merge it into Bitcoin D or whatever the other implementation is, right? So it's kind of a thing where it's like to me, I think it should just be primarily a proposal, but you can say in order to like have that happen, then maybe all soft fork activation needs to actually happen outside of the main line, right? Because otherwise, you can say the maintainers and Bitcoin D developers are kind of put in a weird position where it's like their inaction is maybe viewed as like a veto, right? And I think I've been in that position myself in the past, certain things in LND or the spec or something like that. And that's not the best place to have them in generally. So it seems like things should move in that direction of like doing it outside. That's a little more difficult, obviously, because that increases the coordination cost, right? If it's in Bitcoin D, everyone updates, boom, everything's fine, it's rolled out, everything's cool. But now it's like, okay, well, which client am I going towards over here? So it's definitely like a messy thing. And I think another part of it is like, okay, well, is Bitcoin D Bitcoin, right? Some people say yes. I myself say no. I contribute to BTD, an alternative client. I think that's important for kind of like giving people an option and also just recognizing that like, at the end of the day, like the social scalability of a Git repo is only so high. And I think people need that option to basically fork elsewhere, basically. But that's just kind of like my summarization of like I think the meta discussion right now. Obviously, there's kind of like the covenants thing. I think that's been moved forward. I think, but in the past, people were kind of like, oh, governance is great. But now it's like, okay, well, we want them. Maybe they disagree on how to get there. But I think there's also kind of like the meta discussion that was somewhat, swooped away with Taproot as far as the way speed of trial things like that happened as well too. But it's kind of a thing where if inevitably there isn't some sort of conclusion, it's going to be like this and be very murky and be difficult. And some people think that's a feature as well. So yeah.
Yeah. We had our bit devs here in Austin last week, and Jeremy was here putting forth the case for OpsCTV and his perspective,
Mm-hmm.
in which he mentioned exactly this. Like the maintainers aren't really giving any feedback, so I don't know like how I would get it implemented in core, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
that non-feedback is a slight nod towards hey, maybe try it somewhere else, and that.
Mm-hmm.
And then after Bit Devs had a conversation with another dev who wants OpsCTV, and he mentioned that too. I think the maintainers specifically, there's 5 on the planet that have commit access to Bitcoin Core.
Mm-hmm.
The way it was described to me from this individual is they're at a point where they think they want to stay out of it. Like they don't want to signal either way, and so everybody
Well,
has
yeah,
to
which is a
figure it
reasonable
out.
thing because no one wants to be like feel like they're caught up in this weird thing and there's like external pressure, on you and things like that. And I think another, way Jeremy put in the past is that like, he kind of like views the unspoken part about their users kind of like being in control is also kind of like a product management aspect as well too, right? Where it's like, okay, well, developers have these different ways we can do it, but it's kind of like a thing. It's like a meta thing. Okay, well, should we wait longer? Should we go with this initial thing? What's the market demand look like? Things like that are somewhat missing from the equation at times. And obviously, it's a very nuanced conversation. No one, I don't have the answer. No one has the answers. I think that's why we're generally here in this period. But generally, I think this is very healthy discussion. And I think some people are sort of blowing it out that, oh, this big attack, whatever else. Well, it's like, I mean, he feels like he's just putting it out there for people to go or not. Like, he thinks he's done the job as a developer to propose, and then it's up to whatever else from there. If people think they really need to like directly oppose it by like trying to reject it, cool. To me, that's like someone against the spirit of Bitcoin. It's kind of like, okay, well, my coins are still secure. I can still audit the supply. I can run the numbers. Basically, they can try something else as long as it doesn't mess my stuff up. I don't necessarily need to like prevent them from doing something I don't like as long as there's not some existential risk. Some people think there are. Yeah, I don't know. There's like 5 different sides of this thing, and obviously, always just privileged. We have to like watch from the background and just see how things are flowing because obviously these are very important conversations. I think.
Yeah, this new concept of a user rejected soft fork.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, Jeremy, like, actually, he wrote a script for that. So people want to do it. Like, he has like this Python script that will look at version bit signaling and just reject it. If they really want to do that, they can. But it's I don't know if we're really at that point yet. And even if all this stuff doesn't go through, I think it still like moves the conversation forward. Both as far as activation and also covenants, right? So if anything, I think major props to Jeremy for like getting us to this point basically and having people discuss this thing because they feel like that's something that's so pressing. No matter like how they're interpreting it or kind of like looking at which sides. These are just like important conversations, I think, generally, for the system.
I agree. And for me, at least from my perspective, the main holdup that I have is, again, speedy trial. Is speedy trial the best activation route?
Exactly, right. So so some people are like, okay, well, cool, CTV or whatever else, but we don't really like this, ST aspect of it, right? And that's speaks to some of the activation stuff, as well. And I think it's interesting also that like originally version bits like BIP9 was basically developed such that individuals can make sure you have like multiple concurrent soft forks, right? So okay, we have a bunch of bits, we can signal 3 or 4 of these things or whatever else, and that I thought was a very laudable kind of like goal as far as protocol design, but that hasn't really happened yet, right? And I think it hasn't happened just because of like the somewhat serial nature of people looking and reviewing and stuff, and also getting things into Bitcoin D because like they're like, okay, well, it's better if we all focus on one thing at a given time, right? But in theory, if someone wants to signal a future proof or software I don't really know about, like the software actually has a built-in system to basically warn you if there's a software you don't really know about, right? It's in the logs. You can actually detect that as well too. So I think that feature should somewhat be embraced, just because otherwise, like things may be somewhat surprising, right? Maybe there is demand for this thing that you didn't really know about, but you threw it out there. Because otherwise, there's this kind of like circular discussion around like what is or what isn't consensus. It's kind of a thing where it's like, it's like a know what you see aspect as well too. But then there's kind of like, the intermediate phases of, okay, well, if we can't give it a shot, how do we know that something does or does not have, consensus, you can say.
Yes, exactly. That's the whole rough consensus is this weird amorphous thing that cannot be perfectly defined, and that bugs people. But I think there's certainly demand for these types of covenants. I mean, I've talked to people specifically that work at larger custodians, and they have a very high demand for the type of functionality that OpsCTV would enable, especially in terms of like batching and stuff like that.
So I say that's like a big victory, I think, and something in German Shepherd kind of stuff on the back end that like people are talking about covenants in like a non-scary way, looking at utility, looking at kind of like other possibilities and things like that as well too. And I will say one thing I think somewhat like deters from kind of like better, more nuanced conversations. I think sometimes people get overly caught up in particular solutions or instantations of kind of like what's possible, right? For example, like, CTV enables covenants, right? But also lets you just kind of like do many other things as far as like, having this like compiled on-chain state machine that can be useful for a bunch of other things as well too. So it's kind of, I definitely think it's useful to like pitch a particular use case, but also understand the kind of like some of the generalizability, right? For example, something like no input. No input enables things like L2, but also just like it's just a very useful toolkit in like high level protocol design generally, right? So for example, if you had something like no input, ignoring L2, we could do things like RBF the funding transaction, which isn't really possible today, right? Because if you RBF it, then the current transaction signature is invalidated because it's based on TXID versus the script itself with multi we don't know changes, right? So there's kind of like that like balance of looking at like the generalizability kind of like application to other contexts versus that particular thing. Just because like if you say something like evolve, right? People know in the abstract, but it's also kind of like a very large design space, basically. Of what do you want in general? And I think like you were saying as well, anyone that's like doing a lot of custody really wants something like that. And also, I think it should be a thing where like self-custody is one of the biggest things about Bitcoin itself, and kind of like, the main thing in it added, you actually have an option basically. So anything that like makes that a lot easier and more widely applicable to people that, aren't hardcore Electrum, PSBT users or whatever else, I think it should be a big thing going forward generally. And I think people are starting to emulate these in other ways. For example, like the Block wallet is looking at some things to basically make, custody easier for like larger, for kind of like not super technical individuals. So I think that's a big thing. And like, anything we can do to enable like more non-custodial applications or just systems to build on top of Bitcoin is like plus plus, because that's essentially resistance basically, right? And that's something that we definitely shouldn't lose sight of, I think. There's also kind of like a risk that like that's something I worry about at times. Like anytime there's like some like very big acceleration of like either attention or adoption or like regulatory energies, like, okay, well, have we done enough to get to this point basically, right? And that okay, we're growing, but then all kind of like the environment's also growing, also adversaries are growing themselves as well too. But like have we done enough to basically make sure we can get through that next boss? It's kind of like a thing if you play like an RPG or something like that, you go against a boss, like did you grind enough, or your stat points high enough? Do you have like the proper gear basically, or you're gonna get one shot it, right? And it's kind of a thing where it's like the one shot is a very dire existential thing because maybe we don't get another chance, right? It's like a game where like when you die you lose all your stats, right? You lose everything or something, right? So it's like are we really ready for that? And I think some people that like promote, you can say maybe like premature ossification or something like that, don't necessarily take that into account, right? It's okay, well, to me, because I think there's kind of like a negative failure where if we like ossify prematurely basically and we can't really adapt and extend the system in the future, maybe we fail because our like intellect or strength points or whatever else wasn't high enough to get to that next big boss. And obviously I don't have all the answers. They're just like very fascinating topic to think about and kind of like theorize on and just like watch, because I think I've seen like many different accelerating events basically, and definitely in the last few years there've been a bunch of them. And it's like, okay, whoa, like we're on the global stage now necessarily. People are talking about the utility of Bitcoin beyond just like the whole scammer drug, well, they talk about what people are using for their livelihood, and that's a massive thing and a massive opportunity as well. And just to make sure we're ready to kind of like ride that wave and make sure we're ready for that next wave of adoption, something I was typically think about.
Yeah. In years past, but obviously with the fork wars, we found that market pressures the demand for either higher blocks or heavier blocks via SegWit sort of force the change on the protocol. Like as you said, like as the bosses get bigger and the pressure gets greater, will the network be able to adapt the way it was when it was smaller? And like you said, he didn't say it directly, but there is no respawns in Bitcoin. Like we have.
Yeah, exactly. There's not necessarily a respawn, like, right? And I think it's another thing as well. It's like, if Bitcoin goes down, everything else does kind of. It's kind of like, they're like a cheap clone or something like that, and they're still tethered to the root parent. And if that dies, everything else withers away. But yeah, it's definitely, interesting thing just to consider as far as like, crafting the system to make sure it's more resilient, in the future. And I think it's another thing too where one other positive trend I think I've seen is kind of like people talking about more generalizability, basically. In terms of like, okay, well, what's the simplicity look like? What's like some other kind of like microcode language look like? What's like some zero knowledge stuff look like? Because at that point you can say, okay, well, if you have something that's somewhat more extensible and generalizable, that could be the change to end all changes. Other than some existential quantum thing or something like that, right? Or something that maybe is like a breakthrough cryptography. And at that point, like it's less about like needing to go to bat every single time you think of some new, use case or application, something like that. So, okay, well, let me just use what's here. And obviously, there's kind of like some carefulness needs to be done as far as like selecting that thing so it's not too crazy. At the end of the day, because we have UTXOs, there's no like global, count state. Things are just a lot simpler and a lot more analyzable because it's more like a state machine that you can kind of like draw out in some cases versus like, this thing where anything can call anything else. And that's where a lot of like the craziness happens. And that's how like people have all these multi-million-dollar hacks and things like that.
Yeah. And how do you think the best way to get there is this layered fashion? Does Taro help with this at all?
Good question. Like I think it's a combo of like certain incremental, changes basically, at the same time looking at that like big, let's make the change so we don't really have to make as many changes in the future, right? And that definitely is as something that's been running for several years now as well too. Like I'm optimistic that we can get there. And I think things like Taro kind of like help to like spur people's imaginations as far as like what can be built on the chain itself, how to like approach certain design principles, and also maybe how to like take some of like what's happening elsewhere in the space that like can actually be repurposed and like used as like new design parameters as well too. So I think that's something that I think is important to basically show people what's really possible there. And I think as we should continue to, I think we'll have like more application developers on Bitcoin, which will help to like shape or inform what changes should be there as well, right? Because some people, not everyone like necessarily, designs kind of like other application protocols in Bitcoin. Maybe they're focused on like some more custodial thing, but I think some of that like, input is super valuable. For example, like people like working on the Bitmatrix stuff on Liquid, things like that, where it's like, okay, well, that's, they did a best shot with kind of like what was available. We can use that to refine exactly how we can make those things more succinct or expressible in the future.
Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about Taro. I mean, that's why we were here. You announced it at Bitcoin 2022. or
Yeah,
you gave a
the day
presentation
before.
the day before, and then
Yeah, yeah.
so Taro, Taproot Asset Representation Overlay is a, how would you describe it? A new second layer solution to extend the
Uh,
functionality of Bitcoin.
yeah, yeah. So it's it's basically a way to like add kind of like this overlay layer via like a set of like structured commitments. Basically, it's kind of like a thing where it's like Taro says, "Hey, yo, dog, I heard you like Merkle trees. Here's a whole bunch of other trees within the tree that like let you do proofs about the tree." And that's just kind of like the principle of it, where you embed certain kind of like structured metadata in like the main Taproot tree itself, and it uses like a new tree structure, and that tree structure, is important because it lets you do things like non-inclusion. For example, like let's say I was like swapping some like collectible or something like that. I want you to prove to me you're no longer committing to it. It also supports kind of like this Merkle sum property, which is useful for like verifying supply and just kind of like auditability as well too. Right? For example, like let's say like I had 10 beef bucks and I was giving some to you. Well, I want you to prove to me you're no longer committing to all 10. It should be 7 and I get 3, right? So kind of like it really just tries to put forth a lot of the considerations as far as like safe transfers at the core of the protocol and doesn't try to hide them basically. So and that was kind of like one of the main goals is trying to like try to make things as simple as possible basically, right? Because otherwise it's very easy to get caught up in the massive design space of this stuff in general basically. And I think also just kind of constraining yourself purposely from the design perspective is a really good kind of like just trait because then it makes it easier to understand for other individuals. They can also more easily analyze it as well too, and it's very easy to kind of like ask and respond to questions. And then most of all, it's also is going to make the implementation very very simple as well too. So I think once we drop this code coming out soon, it's actually pretty compact, right? Once you look at kind of like the way everything is done, because as much as possible, it basically tries to reuse things from Bitcoin, right? It tries to like for example like for a VM rather than like making this entirely new virtual machine, which is kind of a big thing where you can do anything last and whatever else. Basically, it's like well let's just kind of like map what we have into what looks like a Bitcoin transaction basically, and then validate that with using the Bitcoin VM itself, which already saves a bunch of time, but at the same time, it gives us an opportunity in the future to add more advanced stuff once we actually know what that looks like and what the demand looks like itself, right? Now, in this case, people can just say, okay, well, I'll take this thing, I'll map it to one input, one output transaction, validate it, boom, everything is fine there, right? So because of that, I think people will find once they really dig into it and like we finalize some of the spec, it's pretty compact implementation wise, which I think is great because that's going to make a lot of these people to adopt it in the future and also just analyze to make sure that it does what it says it actually does.
Yeah, and so let's compare it to similar protocols that Bitcoiners try to leverage via Bitcoin in the past. You have Counterparty, you have Omni, which both, I believe Counterparty did. I know for sure Omni did, but they both leveraged op return. And then,
Yeah, exactly. They both did. I'm still somewhat confused about the lineage there. Even I've like corrected the BIP a few times, trying to say which one came first or something like that. But yeah, so those were very on in the like very early on in the lifetime of Bitcoin. Like that was like 2013, 2014. Counterparty had that big like burn where they burned like a few thousand BTC basically to get these other things on the side. And I think the main difference between something like Taro and those is that like those effectively work by like writing all of the transaction data within the Bitcoin chain using op return, right? So therefore, in order to kind of like realize exactly like, who owns all the assets or kind of like do other operations, you basically need to actually scan the entire chain and then get every single op return in there, basically, and then apply that to your update locally, right? So it resembles more of like an account model, right? You have like an account of all these other things, and you basically apply all these other updates, right? One of the reasons that's a little bit more difficult, and I think why I didn't really get much adoption is like number one, like it's not very like client friendly, right? For example, for me to know what my balance is, I basically need to scan the entire chain and do otherwise I basically delegate to another individual, right? But also it's actually pretty it also presents like a heavy share of Bitcoin nodes themselves, right? Because to do that you basically need something like an address index, which basically lets you like look up the particular balance in a certain address basically, and that's still also a massive thing. It's also very difficult to maintain, things like that. And I think also like it was somewhat hyper specialized, or at least kind of party. Like there was this whole like smart property thing, back then, like the doorknob, blah blah blah. So if you look at the
mhm.
protocol, there's things like okay, property ID, which is really just the asset, but it was so it's kind of like you can say a little bit too hyper specific, I think, for the time. And if you look at it now, it's just not very like intuitive for a Bitcoin developer, right? It doesn't look like the tools we use elsewhere, like Taproot, inputs, the operator whatever else. It's kind of like an entirely different world. So one of the goals for something like Taro is basically make sure it's like very familiar to that Bitcoin developer, basically, because like it's just like a one input, one output, right? For example, like because this, let's say I wanted to do like some type of like swap thing on chain, like kind of like a normal atomic swap, right? Okay, well that's just a multi-input, multi-output, right? Maybe I have like USDT as an input over here, then I have like Bitcoin as an input over here, then we swap that on the other side. Boom, it's fully atomic, that's done, and we know how to do that pretty well. And this also is going to leverage, for example, like it's going to leverage all these recent tools like PSBT, things like that. I can like maybe send you like a partial offer for something like that. We can move it around. So that was one of the main, design goals as far as like making it simple, also making a set that was like a little more Bitcoin friendly, but also at the same time kind of like, showing where things could go in the future, right? As far as like certain more customer properties and transactions, where so you can say, okay, in the future, that could actually be the exact same way Bitcoin transactions are done today, where you basically have like one input, one output, basically, and you can verify everything, using that, because you don't necessarily care about, the outputs, as long as the outputs, aren't creating more Bitcoin than the inputs.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned beef bucks.
Yeah.
Another first use case that many people go to is stable coins. Like, so how,
Yeah.
like, what, like, as somebody, there's a lot of Bitcoiners out there who are very
Mm-hmm.
skeptical of these digital assets. Like, are they
Mm-hmm.
necessary? What do they do?
Mm-hmm.
And do we even need them? Well, sats are a unit of account. Why do we need these
Mm-hmm.
assets when we can just
Mm-hmm.
exchange sats for the assets we want to use? So do we need a plethora of digital assets associated to the Bitcoin blockchain? And like, so how would you
Yeah, I think
position?
it's definitely, yeah, it's definitely, really good question. And just kind of like, in terms of like, motivation, I guess like I'm of the point of view where it's like, for me, Bitcoin is basically it as far as like, kind of like the internet gold, settlement use case itself. But like, people are going to make a bunch of other, random stuff on the side, right? And I think in the past, it was the case where Bitcoin was kind of like the main crossing pair, right? Because, before, Tether and things like that really blew up, every single like altcoin or whatever else was like dominated in BTC. Feathercoin BTC, Namecoin BTC, whatever else, didn't really matter. Everyone wanted more BTC at the end of the day, right? I think, as like things started to grow across more ecosystem, that kind of like went away somewhat, right? I think, because you can say in the past it was very difficult to use sort of like arbitrage opportunity, but stablecoin made that a lot easier, right? Made it a lot easier to basically pop up new exchanges in different jurisdictions as well too. But I think as that has kind of like, moved away from Bitcoin, that kind of like has somewhat diminished that network effect. Bitcoin is kind of like that main crossing pair, basically, right? Because to me, at the end of the day, it's like, okay, well, stuff isn't going to exist. I just want to make sure that Bitcoin can actually power everything and be the main crossing for everything else in the future, right? And I think this helps us to get there, because now at this point you can say, okay, well, it doesn't really matter what you're doing at the end of the day. If you want kind of like the most secure chain, basically, as far as like POW and ownership, things like that as well too, you can at least plug directly into the system here itself. I think another thing that I think is related to that is something a little more long term, mainly kind of like with respect to like demand for block space, right? So I think we're in somewhat of like an anomalous state right now where fees are super low, right? Obviously for us, it's great. Like one side of liking us in the exchange, but it's kind of like, should it really be here? And I think my preface is that like I think some of the activity that prior kind of like was really they're taking a lot of like the actual demand and supply new blocks was actually some of these other more trading arbitrage related use cases basically, right? But now if we're able to kind of like bring a lot of those back to Bitcoin itself, I think that's great for the miners, it's great for the users as well, because that strengthens the network of Bitcoin itself to make sure it's always that initial main crossing pair, right? I think it also really shines when you look at something like the integration of something like Lightning itself, right? So all of a sudden, you have like Lightning, kind of like the main Bitcoin backbone itself, but now we also say, okay, well, I can plug in any other thing, on the sides. Lightning doesn't need to know about it. My node doesn't need to know about it itself, but now that's going to actually generate additional, transactional activity and demand on the network itself. Because now you can say, okay, more routing activity, more routing revenue, more supply, more demand to actually, get into the network itself too. So I think that's a really interesting thing as far as like, letting Lightning Network also be this kind of like, like asset, or you can say currency backbone layer for the world as well too, right?
Mhm.
So, and I think it's an interesting thing because it's done in a way where everything is very firewalled from the edges basically. I don't really need to know about it as me as like a normal Bitcoin node in the center itself, but if they're there, that's cool. But at the same time, less people kind of like have the option to basically plug and play, right? And if you combine this with something like some of the stuff that Mahler's announced at Bitcoin 22 as far as like more point of sale, things like that, that's really interesting. All of a sudden now I could in theory send Bitcoin on my normal wallet basically, and the merchant receives USD, whatever else they receive, right? And
Mhm.
that's a pretty cool thing. Now all of a sudden, like, okay, we have that more agnostic layer, so now we can just plug whatever we want into this thing itself. And because Lightning is fully decentralized, I think that'd be like a really compelling thing for the world. And maybe I think it also helps to kind of like accelerate the transition over to just Bitcoin generally, right? Because now we've made the off ramp a little bit smoother. You just maybe seem to worry about changing whatever else at the other end. But now it's a thing where it's okay. Well, I received it, I have it. I can I can close the channel, I can move it or whatever else. Now at this point, I can just say, okay, well, let me just start holding more Bitcoin, right? And I just continue to do that over time, basically. And now you're fully converted. So I think it's kind of like another tool as far as like looking at the global view of how we ease adoption, basically, and also get in some of these countries that are needing it, but maybe can't just go and flip the switch, similar to someone like a Salvador. Maybe they need kind of like a little bit more of a like a gradual ramp. So that's kind of like how I view like the role of the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, it needs some some stepping stones to get over to the Bitcoin standard.
Exactly. Yeah. Like some people can go 0 to 100, but like they're already somewhat predisposed. But otherwise it may take someone else a little bit longer.
Well, you mentioned the utility that Lightning provides,
Mhm.
this type of overlay network, and so
Mhm.
how does it get to Lightning, right? So you create
Mhm.
these assets in
Mhm.
a Merkle tree embedded in a Taproot transaction. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I believe, if I understand correctly, you just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
take that UTXO, you open a Lightning channel, and then because it's embedded in that
Yep.
transaction, the Lightning network can recognize that you have this data and can transfer that
Exactly.
asset, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? And so I think that's the other thing is that like, it's very Bitcoin like, right? You make a transaction basically, and one of the things that we ended up like, kind of like solving is like, okay, well, typically you need kind of like a unique asset ID, right? And if you look at other chains, they kind of like use this like, global contract hash value as a proxy for that basically. But because Bitcoin doesn't know it, we can't necessarily say, okay, well, this is ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So what we do instead, we basically use the inputs to generate kind of like randomness, basically use that to drive an asset ID, right? And because inputs never repeat, that's double spending. That's basically the whole thing about Bitcoin. Basically, we can kind of like rely on Bitcoin to handle that double spending protection basically, and also give us that uniqueness of the transaction ID in order to create the assets. But yeah, so you're right. It's like like if I want to make an asset, I make a special transaction where I have this commitment, in my Taproot tree itself. It had there's some rules as far as like how you generate the ID, exactly where you place the commitment, things like that. But at that point, you say, boom, I have that asset itself, right? And then me funding is basically similar to the current process right now, where basically I'd open a channel along with someone, and like rather than me just having that single balance, I also have these other balances, right? But these balances are kind of like expressed within the main Taproot tree itself, right? So our multi-sig, let's say we both had bflux referrals, I had 5, you had 5, it would commit to 10 basically, right? And just similar to Bitcoin, we would basically pre-sign that commit transaction, basically let me exit at any given time to make sure that I'm delivering your 5 and my 5, and you send that off as well too. So it looks very Bitcoin Lightning like itself. The main difference there is that now that kind of like extra balance, and also the way these HTLCs are constructed, right? And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's kind of like set up the way where you can actually have what we call like assets at the edges, basically, right? So rather than actually modifying the entire core of the network. So in the past, I think some people looked at like doing things like advertising fee rates in the core of the network, having like a special routing bit say, okay, well I'm going to Litecoin or whatever else or something like that. This case we're saying, okay, no, let's just like ignore all that, make it a lot simpler, and just actually have it at the edges, right? So now the way this works is that you basically need that corresponding input, inbound and outbound liquidity. So let's say you make me an invoice that has BFlux, it quotes that basically. I can then send that along, my first hop. It goes to the Bitcoin network. That's all pure BTC. Everyone's getting Satoshi fees, all the way through the entire hop. Then finally it exits off to you, denominated in that particular value, right? So the cool thing about this is that like given that it doesn't really require like a large internal network change, and I wouldn't want to do that anyway because we should kind of like keep the core of the network as simple as possible and focus on Bitcoin. This lets us kind of like deploy a little more quickly, right? So let's say theoretically, Kraken and then Breeze updater or something like that, right? They can then use that to send amongst each other, pretty quickly, which is a really cool thing as far as like making sure like we can actually focus on distribution, get this thing out there a little more quickly.
Yeah, and so I get you mentioned like Kraken and Breeze there. So I imagine like one of the biggest hurdles is just getting
Mhm.
wallets to recognize each individual asset as their
Mhm.
like is there a way
Uh,
to make it easier on the wallet side?
Yeah, super good question. Yeah, so like that's the thing where I think ultimately there will be like a handful of ones people really, really care about. And I think one other thing about the way we've kind of like constructed the initial architecture is like theoretically we could have an entirely new network for every single asset, right? Which would basically cause basically actually kind of like reconstruct the network effect from scratch. We have like over $300 million on Bitcoin today on the Lightning network. That took a while to get up. How long is it going to take someone else, right? So we're able to kind of like reuse all of the Bitcoin liquidity. So now any increased demand for transactional activity or capacity is going to correspond to like increased Bitcoin on the main network itself, right? So now that's kind of like the flywheel network effect we
Mhm.
have going on there. But as far as like the way walls would handle it, it would kind of like be a thing where they would somewhat like select which ones they really wanted to care about, right? You could construct it where it's like an agnostic type of thing, but similar to someone like hitting some API to like get their Bitcoin balance on the wall, they would need to kind of like know at least like what that asset actually is. So I'm sure like wallet authors are going to like be a little bit more sparing because they want things to actually matter on there basically, right? And as long as the receiver has like that inbound liquidity, I can send that. For example, like let's say someone had like USD somewhere else, I can actually just send Bitcoin all the way onto that last hop that gets converted, which is a really cool thing. Also, the other way around, right? I could like send USDC or T or whatever else on my initial hop and then receive Bitcoin on the other end as well. So I think Wallace will basically like pick which ones. I think there'll be like a few ones people really care about, and maybe some like novelty things of people like trading Pokemon cards directly or something like that. And I think that's really cool just because like I think that also just gives wallet providers and authors just more creative freedom, you can say, as far as exploring other business models or maybe looking at different ways to like, expand their wallet and like vertically integrate it as well. So I think that's good because I think generally like, more entrepreneurial like energy in Bitcoin is just better. I think, giving people more options to basically continue to like, make all these other companies look at different ways they can be, organized given like the global nature as well. People maybe won't go to Silicon Valley and, do that little thing. Maybe they have another option on the side. So I think that's kind of like an interesting thing as far as like, enabling like a larger economy in terms of like companies on Bitcoin beyond kind of like the more fundamental stuff. We can say, custody, multi-sig, whatever else, kind of like going into that other direction as far as what else is possible.
Yeah. No, since this leverages Taproot, now I'm going down like a privacy thing. Like, is there a way you can privately issue, like say you had like a group, like a club, maybe like a Soho house, but you want it to be like secret and only people who had certain Taro assets for this associated with this club could access them, could get access to the party or the building or whatever. Now I'm getting really like bored ape.
Yeah, but that's totally possible. Like like you're saying, it's kind of like a selective reveal thing, right?
Yes, but like since it's in the Taproot, like you can't like see basically see a Taproot transaction on the chain and know that there's Taro assets associated with it. You have to
totally. Yeah. So I could give you like a random, TX ID that's like pure Taproot, and like, if you don't have the extra information, you don't know what's really going on, which is a cool thing, right? So I think certain use cases, like for example, I think someone like issuing a stablecoin or whatever else, like there's an incentive because people want to basically like be able to like verify the total supply, right? So similarly, because like we have this Merkle sum thing, I'll be able to like find like an on-chain index basically and verify the integrity of that. Say, okay, well, there's 2 billion USDT on the chain right now, and at all times I know that, right? I think it's really cool because if you look at like the way it's done on other chains, something like that, like maybe sometimes there's like a Twitter bot that says, okay, things were issued or whatever else. Will you be able to kind of like actually see events of that on chain and obtain that data to basically make sure everything else adds up properly? So that's one of the things that we wanted to make sure was kind of like at the forefront. Being able to audit the total supply of a particular thing, and also just know when other issue events are happening. But like you were saying, if it's some like other like constrict ticket or something like that, you don't necessarily need to get everyone else involved. It's kind of like the necessary parties, revealing the proofs and verifying them as well. And so I think that's another cool thing as far as, okay, well, this doesn't necessarily need to be a public thing. Maybe I want like some other thing on the side, basically, that's between a smaller group of participants. This can be used for that as well. And you can ignore all the like, auditability, public proofs, blah, 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 because you don't really need to do that for maybe some certain use cases.
Yeah, that's fascinating how far it can go down this rabbit hole and what these things can be used for. And that's like, even if you're a skeptic when it comes to these digital assets, I think from the Lightning Network perspective, the increase in liquidity that this could provide the Lightning Network is like a massive win. Like
definitely.
Whether you think these things should exist or not, you should be bullish on the fact that it's going to help Lightning Network liquidity.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like if I'm like a major not Lightning Network operator, like worst case, okay, it doesn't really happen, whatever else, I'm still here. Best case, all of a sudden I 10x my volume, I make more revenue, I have like more realistic, routing activity, I'm making other decisions as far as like, allocating my capital. That becomes like a bigger, opportunity for kind of like general like yield generation on Bitcoin generally as well. So I think the network effects work out pretty well where, if things go well, even if you're not directly interfacing with it, like you'll benefit basically. Given that like it's not dumping a bunch of data onto the chain itself, and like any transactions it's generating are just like normal transactions to miners anyway, and they're verifying that as it goes. But at the same time, like certain aspects of the way it's designed, for example, like let's say there was like a covenant that kind of like had more accessibility, right, or was able to at least kind of like govern what an output looks like, right? Because like the Taro tree actually impacts the Taproot tree, which impacts the actual output key itself. I could feasibly make a covenant such that it's like, okay, well, I'm actually enforcing certain transitions or structure or kind of like details on the Taro layer in the Bitcoin layer without the Bitcoin layer necessarily knowing exactly what's happening there. Right, so that's another cool thing as far as like you being able to compose all these other tools. It's probably other things you can do with maybe something like a DLC or something like that, kind of like representing a position and like being able to move that position around, things like that as well too. So I think there's definitely some interesting things as far as like composing what we already have, given everything is already so Bitcoin-like. So it's not like I need to learn some entirely other system as far as like, okay, it's an account. Okay, we use like somewhere 256 bit integer or something else. Okay, well, that's the output. This is the commitment. The commitment affects the output. Therefore, I know what I can do on that point. I know how to interpret these fields, and things are also extendable. It uses this like format that we created for the Lightning Layer. It's called TLV, kind of like a type length value. So it's like a protobuf thing where you can basically kind of like have future extensibility in the actual asset itself as well too, right? So that's another cool trait. For example, people can add other stuff in there. I don't know exactly what they do. I have like some kind of like use case, but I think it's another thing as far as like if we want to evolve the system in the future, we can do so. For example, some things that like popped up and so kind of like early design drafting is, for example, like right now the values are all public. In the in the commitment itself, because I could use them for something. Feasibly, you could do some other kind of like blinded integer type of Palier, CC type of thing itself. Another thing as well is that like right now we use SHA-256 for all the commitments basically, but there's certain like hash functions that are a little more kind of like you can say like snark friendly, right? So right now like I'm showing you all the information basically, you're verifying the commitment, you're revealing it, but I can say basically just give you a proof that this output is well formed, right? And if we use kind of like a snark friendly hash function, that makes it a lot more efficient as well too. Right. So at the end of the day, it's like, it's all about revealing and verifying proofs, but, I don't necessarily need to explicitly give you all the information there. And there are ways to make it a lot more succinct. I think things are coming a long way now in the past few years. I think it's like the tooling and stuff like that isn't quite there, but potentially that could be a thing where my Taro proof to you is just zero knowledge proof basically that goes back through the chain. And maybe it's a little bit more expensive to generate, but maybe, we're getting things like, FPGA accelerators, GPU accelerators, things like that as well too, that make, maybe a 10 or 100x difference in the proof generation. Because depending on what you're using, the size is still pretty good. And even if the size is like a kilobyte or two, that's not that bad in the grand scheme of things. Also because it's all off chain. Never actually goes on chain where you just commit to the proof itself.
Nice. It's just, could be the base for something really. Yeah, it's like one thing I really don't think Bitcoiners appreciate. I don't shouldn't say Bitcoiners generally. A lot of people don't appreciate it. Is that we can't even fathom the use cases and the applications that Bitcoin generally, and then something like Taro more specifically could bring to fruition in the future.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think to me, that's like the exciting part about like, looking at the pieces a little bit differently and like finding that like one combination that, that's like a really new thing. Right. So I think that's something that people just embrace a little bit more. Cause I feel like at times when we're talking about particular changes, like, we get caught up in a particular behavior or application or whatever else, it's kind of like a thing where it's like, like inevitably it's going to enable things we don't necessarily fully know, right? If you look at something like, what we figured out as far as like opcat checks from cyber that was existing for a while, and people are like, we can track this thing, this and thing, right? So to me, it's like somewhat inevitable, also kind of like the exciting part, right? And that's kind of like where you can say like the free energy or like, protocol entrepreneur or kind of like ingenuity can come in. It's like, okay, well, someone looking at the pieces slightly different, angle basically and saying, well, this is really possible. For example, like, we've seen this with things like, Lightning, general state chain stuff, DLC stuff, whatever else. So to me, like, I'm very bullish in just future ingenuity, and I don't necessarily know everything is going to come. Some of you ask me like, exactly what's this particular thing going to be used for? I'm like, it seems kind of useful and it's kind of bounded. So I think my future self is going to think of something, but I don't necessarily want to like restrict just because I can't think of something now, because otherwise I feel like, I'm not necessarily like, I can't see into the future, right? Like maybe I have like instinct, something like that, but I don't necessarily know what's possible. I think, things like to hopefully show people exactly like, what's exactly possible. I think an interesting thing too is like, even just like launching this thing, like, for example, we launched it right before Bitcoin 2022. I had developers come up to me like, I'm working on Solana, or I'm working on these other chains. I want to come back now. Just because like that shit doesn't work, it's down for 24 hours basically. Bitcoin, is always up. If I can do that little thing I need to do, okay, cool. For me, it's like, okay, I don't necessarily know what it is, but they're gonna pay chain fees at the end of the day, and maybe generate some like Lightning routing revenue. So cool, like so. If we can bring it back, I think that was always kind of like you can say a kind of like the proverb, right? If it gets hot somewhere else, we'll bring it to Bitcoin, right? Or you can, or I think it was more so like it will be brought to Bitcoin. I think that was kind of like missing. You can take some agency. Okay, well, who, right? Okay, the things are there basically. I think this is like, okay, well, individuals that are motivated can package up the goodness basically, remove a lot of the cruft, make it, nice and Bitcoin-like and bring it over. I think that's always like, something that people somewhat take for granted that it will be done. But we need that agency basically. Say, okay, well, we're going to continue to improve the system. Basically, it doesn't get really, really hot elsewhere. If we want more block space demand or something else, we can bring it back over to the main chain where it all started.
Yeah, and you're a man with a lot of agency. You've taken the bull by the horns and built a lot of really cool shit. So thank you for that.
No, definitely, always fun.
What would you describe as? I'm trying to think of how to frame this. Like, I don't know if there's like trade-offs with Taro, but like, so obviously these assets are being issued. And they have a price attached to them. There's going to be some oracle risk there. If there's like large custodians issuing these assets, and therefore they acquire a lion's share of the liquidity of the Lightning Network, what does that mean
Hmm.
for the distribution and censorship resistance at the Lightning
Hmm.
layer? How does that affect the build out of Lightning overall? How would you
Uh, yeah,
describe
yeah.
these
I guess,
things?
yeah, really good question. I guess I answer that initial thing first is that like I think because everything is like fully at the edges, like things are somewhat firewalled, right? For example, let's say someone issued some crazy like credit token or something like that, right? Because it's actually just at the final hop, there's no like default risk that the core network is actually subject to, right? But let's say we actually had that in the internal network basically, and like that thing we thought was $1 million, now it's zero. All of a sudden someone accepted that, and that kind of propagates like a lot of like weird risks, right? So I think because it's actually like I say things basically be fully at the edges and does a lot of things like like a hot pin or a blinded route type contract basically, things are a little bit more, I would say, like firewalled away. Not to say there's no other thing going on that maybe we haven't thought about, but at least like that lets me sleep a little better at night. And okay, well, someone doesn't want to know about it, they don't really know about it, and also it's actually fully at the edges of the system as well. But as far as you can say, like other trade-offs, the system makes, there's certain trade-offs around kind of like like moving assets around. For example, like because we require kind of like the commitment or that asset ID to be like concrete, like the out point itself. You can't necessarily do things like issue an asset and then transfer it in the very same transaction, right? Because you need to reference that out point, but the out point isn't finalized until it's actually into the chain itself, right?
Hmm.
So you need to do things like, okay, well, I'm going to issue it. Maybe I can burn something, but at the same time, then I'll do another transaction. So we have that like very stable identifier, right? And I think one of the other trade-offs is makes like because it relies on Bitcoin a lot for double spend prevention and kind of like non-relatability of these outputs. There's certain cases where if you don't do something properly, the asset just may be burned, right? And that's because like, okay, well, you didn't follow the rules, so therefore everyone that's validating things just assumes it's like not valid. For example, like one case would be, let's say I have like 10 beef bucks and then I make 15, right? That's invalid. And I just also just forfeited those 15 just because I spent the out point where it was being committed to, and I can't recreate the out point because I can't, undo Bitcoin itself. So that's
Hmm.
another traffic makes. It's kind of like a thing, around finality. I think there are ways to get around that, but like maybe they'll just introduce a lot more complexity into the system, which is something that we're trying to make a little bit simpler. And then maybe it's okay, for now in the future. And I'd say the other, larger trade-off it makes as well is, related to basically like the proof size, right? So, as mentioned, like things like, mastercard camera or whatever else, in the past, you basically had to embed every single thing you wanted to verify the transaction into the chain itself, right? And that was, pretty, very unscalable and also like, difficult to work on my clients. In the case for Taro or something like that, my asset itself like proves the provenance to you itself, right? Which necessarily means that, you may need to go back and verify like that initial chain or linkage, right? So you can say in the best case, it's kind of like a linear thing, but in the worst case, it can be it can be larger than that as well too, right? So in the future, we have some ideas around kind of like doing things like compressing the proofs, kind of like like burning and then reissuing an asset, basically lets you kind of like have a clean slate, and then also the zero knowledge proofs aspect as well can eventually help us to compress that down a little bit more. I think the other big thing is that like because you have that Lightning layer, anytime you open the channel, you move it onto Lightning itself. You're not really expanding the number of hops it took, right? That's compress things down. I think another cool thing we compose, for example, things like state chains, some Mercury Water is doing as well too. That could feasibly be used to also let people trade these things amongst themselves, but keeping that same output there with those varying trade-offs as well too.
What are your thoughts on these Chalmia mints that are coming, like Fedimint, Mini Mint? Have you looked into that at all? Because that's actually throughout this
Mhm.
conversation, that's where my mind's been going. Like, could you do like Taro assets in these
Yeah,
Chalmia mints? And like, because I
yeah.
think they can enable the free banking system
Mhm.
that Hal Finney envisioned at the end of 2010 in his BitcoinTalk.org post.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely interesting. And like, I remember I was talking with Obi, who I think gave a talk at Bitcoin 22 about kind of like, his, view is kind of like looking, okay, well, maybe if you're in Africa, not every individual is necessarily going to be able to do the full self custody thing, but they at least trust there's some local leaders or something like that, or some people, the community village or whatever else, they can help do that. But I think this is definitely like, for example, they could issue stuff on top of that, on top of Tower, and basically then use those within that local thing. It could be something as well where like they issue some local currency and people can use that outside, but what they want to come within kind of like this closed system. It's super beneficial. I think also generally, if we see kind of like more cases of things like Bitcoin Beach pop up, things like that as well too. Well, okay, if they're already kind of like doing some shared custody thing, might as well add some of the privacy benefits into that as well too. think that's a really cool thing, just because like, this can let you compose a bunch of other things together. For example, like one limitation with the system is that like, you can route like regular assets, but you can't necessarily route like collectibles, right? And collectibles like a baseball card or a charter card, something like that, right? But in theory, if I used something like a state change type contract, basically, I could move ownership of that off chain itself, right? Which is a really cool thing, because obviously now I can combine other different versions as well too. So I think that's the other interesting thing. Like, once you have more of these like protocol pieces, like, you can say something like Lightning, state change, DLC, covenants, whatever else, like the amount of things you can construct is really, really starts to blow up, basically. I think we'll be impressed, assuming things, go as like, in my ideal case, like the next 5 years, I think, there'll be some really impressive stuff we can do on Bitcoin, which, is the main thing is basically non-custodial relationship itself, more decentralization, also like letting individuals make the protocols they want to without necessarily compromising, right? And compromising to me is like, custodian or kind of like a weird multi-sig thing or something like that. If we can kind of like, encode more direct, kind of like constraint relationship into the Bitcoin itself, that's very good. But obviously there's some trade-offs as far as like complexity, things like that. But I think, we've been thinking about this stuff for long enough. And I think my current model, like just the UTXO model generally, just because it's in the end, it's like, it's just a state machine on chain at the end of the day, that really balances a lot of like kind of like the scariness or kind of like some of the unexpected activities like elsewhere, because like, anytime I'm spending something, I know exactly what's happening. I basically have my entire world there. I'm not worried about every single possible other, contract that can interact and like the ordering guarantees, blah, blah, blah. So I think we have like a very solid base on Bitcoin that somewhat, under recognized as far as like some of these more advanced use cases that make it a lot easier to just maintain and understand and just use generally. So.
And what are some of the things that help? Is like something like Musig, like the UX of issuing this asset. Is it Musig too, or Musig that's involved? Or
yeah, Musig. Well, yeah. So like, in theory, you could combine, Musig two and things like that to like, have like different custody profiles of the assets themselves, right? So for example, like, there's like a particular key. So like, let's say there's certain asset that maybe you want to issue multiple times, right? It's like a tranche. Maybe it's like, a company issuing more equity or something like that, right? There's a special key that needs to sign the future, issuance events, basically to link that to the same chain. That key can be used, that can be a Musig 2 key, right? So that can be like a 3 of 3 or NMN or something like that as well, in order to, give you a little more flexibility there. And also like, goes all the way down to like the lowest layer as well too. If I wanted to require, different signatures or something like that, or more traceability, for example, in the Lightning case, we do a thing where we basically like embed the HTLC at the Taro layer as well too, right? So you also need to basically show me that premium and things like that to basically make sure that like if the asset is on chain, you're not just trying to move it before things are actually valid or something like that, right? So, it's a thing where definitely some other trade-offs are being made there. I think we still need to think more about like, exactly other areas that make sense. But to me, once again, it's like, okay, well, I already thought of this one particular thing. I think there's other cases that will be a lot more interesting as far as like, doing more interesting things, on that, Taro layer with some of the caveats as far as like, burning on the upper layer if you don't necessarily follow everything to a T.
Yeah. There's so many moving parts of this. And so you mentioned at Bitcoin 2022, you had people working on other chains coming up to you and saying, all right, I want to build this on Bitcoin. It's got uptime security. And now it seems the usability and or ability to do what I'm trying to do. Do you think this can be a driver to get developer talent working on the Bitcoin stack?
Yeah, I definitely think so, right? Because I think, there are some of these other people, like, maybe they have a use case you don't necessarily care about, but like they at least wanted to use Bitcoin in the beginning. And then because they didn't understand it or they didn't really see these solutions out there, they went elsewhere, right? And it's kind of a thing where it's like, we're talking like some of them, they don't really want to be elsewhere, like they, like, even if they, like, for example, maybe they'll put Lightning in it somehow and like, cross it over, but like if they can come back, I think it's a great thing because I think that just brings more developer attention. Also kind of like, broadens, you can take the application layer of Bitcoin itself, right? So I think that, there's some developers that are very good at, things like, Bitcoin D level stuff, kernel level stuff, or kind of like, some of the more security aspects. Maybe they don't necessarily know what like a protocol application that layer would necessarily look like, right? I think more of those kind of like thinking in voices, for example, people have done a lot of work on that, or like Shashek, I know what I'm saying, right? And also like, Jeremy, as far as other tooling, things like that. So I think over time, as we get more of those developers on board, like the tooling will get more advanced as well too. Today we have things like Miniscript, or else, whenever you're kind of like, designing a more kind of like elaborate protocol, it needs to be more so on kind of like the transaction level, basically, right? And okay, well, these are all the possibilities. If I go here, you can go there, things like that as well too. I think we still need better tooling on that, and things like Sapio, are like, probably some of the best things we have in that domain. But I think that's a very promising thing of basically like, bringing back those developers, basically strengthening that Bitcoin, network effect itself, and also like, getting that knowledge distributed a lot more broadly, so that in the future people can just say, okay, well, let me just go straight over here versus taking this very roundabout road, and all of a sudden I have this token that I don't fucking want, and now I got to bring it back, things like that. So we can, we can have to shortcut them now. And I think that was also just generally like just pretty good validation to the people coming elsewhere. It's like, yo, like I can do this now. Like, let me just come back. I don't want to learn this new random language or something, right? Like, I just want to do my thing, basically, not worry about like the platform risk or kind of like any other shakiness, at that lower level.
Yeah. It's, again, I go back and forth. I'm one of those. I'm like, I don't really care for any of those things, but I do recognize like people do. It's like, all right, why not build it here? If it does help liquidity. It's.
I think it's a really reasonable take too, where it's like, I don't necessarily know if what they're doing is like the actual right thing, but I kind of like, respect their freedom to experiment, basically. And that's always kind of like the whole permissionless invasion thing about Bitcoin. It's like, okay, well, they can do a thing as long as it doesn't infringe on my, UTXOs or like the supply or whatever else, they can do it. And if there are some cases where like, it's just very, has some weird negative incentives, I think, people will kind of like go out and like, address those things. But to me, it's kind of a thing of like, just growing the pie, basically, making Bitcoin, more, prominently available and just kind of like on the mind of individuals to correct their kind of like the FUD of like the Bitcoin, the TI-83 calculator or whatever. Like, no, it really isn't. Like, you can do a lot of stuff. You just need to like, look at it in like in the proper way. And it also like, prioritizes just security generally. Because I think it's kind of a thing where if you look at some of these other ecosystems, like people are very desensitized to like hacks, right? They call it rug pulls, right? It's like, no, bro, you lost your money. You know what I mean? Like, you lost your fucking money. Like, it's not a rug pull, right? So it's just desensitized. Like, people don't blink at these crazy hacks. I remember back in the day, Bitcoin exchange got hacked for 10 million. It's like, oh my God, Bitcoin's insecure, it's done, blah, blah, blah. Now we get 600 million and they're like, oh, our buyers are going to bail it out. Like, it's like, I don't know about that.
Yeah, SBF's going to step in and bail us all out.
Exactly. Let me just get this, $2 billion out of nowhere. Where did it come from? Don't worry about it. Like, we're just going to put it back in the system.
Yeah, there's this weird masochistic enjoyment of the rug pull on Twitter, at least for a lot of people. Yeah. It's weird. Yeah. But
I don't want to be in that position, and hopefully, nothing we make ever puts people in that position as well. And that's always like a big thing as far as understanding it, making sure self-custody is a big part of it, making non-custodial whenever possible. Also, just like educating people generally too.
Yeah, and more generally, zooming in on, just thinking of things that you've built that I'm excited about. Like the assets is cool. Like I want more liquidity on the Lightning Network. It feels like Lightning Network has hit an inflection point. What I'm really excited to see, like on the back end of what could be a potential inflection point. It seems like just from a liquidity, mind share, and a branding perspective, Lightning Network is here. It seems like it's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's only going to get stronger from here. But stuff like URL auth and LSATs, like once that people start building on those protocols and injecting the Lightning Network into the internet stack, that's what really gets me excited.
Oh, no, totally. And that's always been the thing where it's like, I got this like master plan in the background. Sometimes I need the components, but I feel like now like many of those components there as far as like, making, Lightning Bitcoin like a more integral part of the web and just the browsing experience, we're so close, right? And I think this is like, this is what people should be calling Web3, though it's a horrible name. What does that even mean at all? It's like, call it new internet, call it, like what, like the web, Bitcoin native internet or something like that. But I think it's really cool. For example, like, so LSAT, people that don't know, is something based on something called HTTP 402, right? So the idea is, okay, well, back in the day, there's kind of like this error code, and error codes are kind of like, okay, you go to a website, it's not there. 404, 200 means everything's okay. 300 redirect, things like that as well too. This says, oh, payment required, right? And this has always been a peak thing. Like, okay, well, if no one really uses, they're kind of like some like very just organizational, like, kind of like working groups created around it, that nothing really happened, right? So what this does was like, okay, well, we'll use a thing called a macaroon, basically, which is kind of like this API token in a sense. The API token kind of like has certain like structured capabilities. Okay, maybe it's expired after a day, whatever else. It's usually by it's given party. What we'll do, we'll basically embed an invoice, in the header response of 402. Basically, you pay that invoice. Once you pay the invoice, you get the pre-image from the invoice, and you can basically combine this LSAT and the macaroon, and basically the pre-image, and have this full authentication token. That's a really cool thing, right? Because all of a sudden now I can basically like, do a button click, and then the browser or the extension of JS, whatever, have everything automatically. So this can let you do things like, pay-per-go APIs. I can do like login. I can do like the upvote for payment. I can, get rid of all these spam bots on Twitter. Also, like the spam bots got worse. What happened? Like,
I don't know.
Like, every single thing I look at, there's 20 of these things. And the other thing is, well, I've never been impersonated. So maybe, is that good or bad? I don't know. Am I not big enough yet to like, to get my own spam bot? Like, man, it's cool. But, this would let you kind of like, destroy things things like that.
The spam, it's something happened in the last 3 months specifically where
Yeah,
it's
someone shut something off. Someone turned something on. I don't know, but it's a different place.
well, like let's explain how like because the idea of again LSAT like the one killer use case is just like pay per API call like
Yeah,
over the
yeah,
Lightning Network. Like that blows my mind thinking about like
definitely.
how it will affect and make markets extremely efficient because you're paying for exactly what you're getting, right? And nothing
Exactly.
else or nothing
Yeah, and
less.
then you get really cool combinations. For example, like someone was running it before, but basically it was kind of like they were, doing LSAT stuff to basically let you pay per minute for like VPS access. Basically, like they were kind of like virtualized to give you a little thing, SHH, whatever else. That's really cool. For example, like let's say I just want to like do some like basic analysis. Boom. Do I want to like do the AWS subscription? Do I want to like look at their billing model or whatever else? I can just like get in and out very very quickly. And these also cool for kind of like other companies looking at like different pricing models. Typically, there's kind of like the freemium. Okay, it's free, then you need to pay. And there's kind of like subscription. There's that kind of like gray area was okay. Let me just do like what I need to do. Particularly at that point too. That's maybe also more resource efficient for them because they know they can kind of like resell that particular resource somewhere else. So I think that's definitely a big enabling thing. One thing, people ask me times like why hasn't it fully caught on? What's really going on? But I think one missing component in the past was kind of like two things. One is basically the proper client side interface, right? So we use LSAT today in a lot of our services. You kind of like pay a small amount of satoshi and you basically get an API key. You use it for that. We do a bunch of other things alongside of it as well too. But like there wasn't a very easy way of like allowing a developer to basically like hook into that API itself, right? So there were things in the past like WebLN or also something called now Albi, which I'm a big fan of, which basically kind of like working to like make that interface a lot more streamlined, basically, right? And then that's going to be a really cool thing because now this is like what you need as far as like being able to like click reply and then it sends one sat to Twitter or whatever else, or two sat, right? Because otherwise it's kind of like okay, here's the QR code, let me scan it. Okay, what's going on? I'm waiting, whatever else. Like once you like push that a lot more into the background, there's going to be a new wave of people on the internet that say, okay, well, this is how it just works. How could it work anywhere else, right? Like what was it like when you had to like input a credit card and get this piece of thing out of your pocket, and then like where is it? Who's storing the credit card information? Is it them? Are they going to get hacked? Is it on the browser? A lot of weird things around that, right? So I think that's definitely coming, and it's something that I'm super excited about. I think the other component that's missing is kind of like additional tools on the web development side, right? Actually, Buck made a bunch of really cool things, in this area as far as like being able to like have like a existing web framework and kind of like make that outside aware. All right, so I don't know if people know something like Flask, which is like very popular Python framework. If I can do something like add like an annotation that says okay, LSAT amount equals 10 sat or something like that, boom, right? And then I know the web server basically handles all the negotiation referrals. When it comes to my side, everything is good at that point too, right? So I think we have that first component now. Second component is coming up, and I think the big thing that's going to really supercharge the first component was also something we work on in the background, and hopefully to restart a little more now is also like actually getting Neutrino basically into the browser, right? So this is a really cool thing because if you look at something like the MetaMask for browsers, kind of like gives you a similar UX and experience, is basically hitting one centralized API, right? That thing goes down all the time. People are like, what's going on? They're getting a lot of data. It's probably a honeypot. Like who knows what's gonna happen with all that stuff? They know everyone's balanced. They know what you're doing. They can front your transaction. They can do a bunch of other stuff. In this case, we're saying no, let's not do that. Let's actually just like move everything directly into the browser itself. So I would have like LND and Neutrino in the browser. One cool thing about Neutrino is that because the protocol is actually fully stateless, I can fetch block headers, filters, and blocks from like a CDN or something like that, right? That's gonna be very very fast. And also I can verify everything that's going on there, so I don't need to worry about additional issues there. One other thing that's happening in Lightning protocol right now is like people are adding a way to basically advertise like a WebSockets address, right? So then at that point I can basically use Bitcoin, get the Bitcoin protocol via HTTP, and then talk WebSockets about Lightning nodes as well too. All of a sudden I basically have the exact same user experience. Developers are going to love it, but at the same time everything is still fully non-custodial basically, and also I'm not relying on anyone else to basically gather all this data and just like tell me what things are active or not because of the way the protocol is now. So I think at that point it's going to be okay. Someone's going to basically download an extension, then get on board into Lightning itself, and then we'll have things like, for example, getting like zero comp channel via something like Pool, or else basically have that bootstrapping be, as tight as possible. So it could be a thing where it's okay, like, download this thing within a minute or two, right time I see it, all of a sudden I'm on the internet. Obviously, you don't want to put 100 BTC in this thing. It should be like a smaller amount. It's like another wallet, kind of like a spirit chain. I think at that point, distribution, in my opinion, will kind of like be solved as far as like how do you actually make sure people have to interact with this stuff. And at that point, it's more on the hands of kind of like application developers, also businesses as well, to take advantage of that thing, right? One cool thing I saw, I think it was maybe last year, people kind of like integrated Ghost, or sorry, they integrated Lightning into something in Ghost, which is kind of like another way to do a Substack as like open source thing. Yes, when I saw it, I was like, okay, this is dope. This has been like on my list. People are looking at it. There's that demand there as well too. Once we fix the client side tooling and the server side as well too, like there would be like everything else is gonna look dumb as an alternative, right?
Yeah, I'm not being rude here because this is what we implemented in Ghost, and I'm going to send this tweet to Carr, but like we can show an example on the video here of like how much better this user experience could be, because right now we've essentially just integrated BTC Pay Server into Ghost and have enabled these 10-cent paywalls. So you pay a dime worth of sats and you get the article. But like, I mean, it's nothing novel. I mean, Y'all's was doing this, but we just did it. We just did it on Ghost specifically.
Yeah. And I think the thing there is just kind of like, the packaging and the distribution, right? Where it's like, without something like this, how do they get it up on the server side? Who's doing it for them? Also, like in the client side, or they, do they know what a Lightning invoice is? Or they're scanning it manually? But this case, it's kind of like a click and go, which I think is a super dope thing. And I think this is a big thing too, where it's like, one of the main problems of Lightning Network that we've been working kind of fulfilled, and we're getting really close to there at that point now too, is where like, no one wants to like pay $80 for that Wall Street Journal article and do the subscription. It's like, bro, the article is probably not even going to be good. Why am I going to commit upfront to this? You know what I mean? Like, right? Like, it's going to be some like clickbait or something. Let me just like do a little bit. Let me check it out. Like even something like that. Let me pay 5 cents and like give me 2 paragraphs. I'm going to judge from there. And I'm going to go or not, right? And definitely one thing I think people brought up in the past in regard to this are kind of like Nick Szabo's old post, around kind of like costs like micropayments, basically. Okay, we'll not technology whatever else. I think what those people will get wrong and now is okay. We're a lot better just general like UI crafting and software development, also human computer interaction than we were back then as well too, right? So if you have kind of like an agent that you express the preferences to, this is even covered in the thing itself, then that can actually do all the actions on my behalf. So let me do a budget of $1 a day basically, do actions up until that basically, and if I hit that point, then I'll reassess. So it's not continuously a yes or no type of thing every single time. So you can have like budgets, things like that. That's also something that like this thing we made called LNC helps you do. So in the past, like one other I think necessary component as far as like getting this kind of like web experience down is like today it's very difficult to like securely pair a website to like a Lightning node, right? Okay, maybe like do I build a TLS server? Do I get a macaroon? Is my port even open or whatever else? What this does, it basically gives you kind of like a very easy way to like have like a pairing phrase basically. I put the pairing phrase into the website itself. That I get from my node. Then at that point, I basically have a secure end-to-end encrypted connection, right? So from the browser to my node is fully encrypted, and we're using regular gRPC things or whatever else. And this is really cool because all of a sudden now a website can say, oh, connect Lightning. Boom, you click that, you put in this like very like small pairing phrase, all of a sudden you're hooked up. Which I think that's gonna be like a very major thing as well too. Because all of a sudden now like people can develop websites with the JS APIs of Lightning in mind, right? And not worry about, oh, am I connecting to all these different nodes or whatever else. If we can standardize that interface basically as far as the RPC capabilities, that's gonna be a massive thing. Because now all of a sudden, all the web developers that before were kind of like unsure what to do, basically they had like all the energy and kind of creativity there. This is basically their gateway now to enable those experiences in a very seamless manner.
Yeah, I mean, you see how quickly Stripe took over the world with their like payments API.
Exactly, yeah.
Imagine what
people just want that easy call, basically, right? And like they obviously wanted to get to the market super quickly, so it's kind of like their API. But you can have that standardized API, then have like different implementations of it. One can be LND, one can be in a Clear, one can be Strike, whatever else. So once we kind of like get that initial interface right, I think that's the point where it's like okay, people that were even on the side, not necessarily Bitcoin or Lightning enthusiasts, just because it lets them do that cool thing on the internet without worrying about a credit card, a subscription, or whatever else, they will come, and that'll become like a new, wave of users as well, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and it's also one of my this particularly is one of my favorite use cases to rebut the idea that Bitcoin just for money launderers and gamblers. It's like no, this is a utility does not exist in the other system. Like this is not possible without Bitcoin and the Lightning Network.
Exactly, and like the podcasting stuff, general streaming, things like that. So we've seen a few more pieces, probably into place. But I think by like in the next year or so, it's going to be really dope. Just because like Wallets is getting a lot better now, Pathfinder is getting a lot better, UX is getting a lot better. Now we have like additional tool for developers. Then we have other things like Taro as well. Let them kind of like have additional creativity and application space. So things are definitely come together at least on this higher layer. I'm super excited about things from here.
And it's crazy how it's happening globally too. Like at 1031, we obviously see a lot of the companies that are building in the space around the world, and that's one thing that I've seen more recently is these companies building on the Lightning Network protocol all around the world and providing utility in areas of the world that desperately need it. Southeast Asia, Africa, LATAM. It's
definitely. Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that as well. Just as far as like people wanting some advice or kind of like looking for advice kind of raise, where it's like it's definitely becoming a lot more international thing. South America, Guatemala, places in Nigeria and Ghana as well, elsewhere, and also now like other parts of Europe too. So I think that's something that like a lot of the naysayers don't realize. Where it's like, okay, well, maybe you have a very U.S. centric view, okay, whatever else, but if you're talking about the actual world and things are just changing a lot now, generally in the world as far as like just independence and things like that. I think that's the really cool thing. And I think it's also where things like Taro can help out as well too. Because anyone that's I've met in the past working on some sort of like remittance thing, basically, this is always kind of like one of their issues as far as like doing that last mile, basically, right? But if we're able to kind of like at least make the last mile a little bit smoother, or maybe let people kind of like skip certain steps of it, that really supercharges things a lot. Because now at this point they're not worried about okay, well I need a bank account to hold whatever else, things like that. Things can get a little bit more complicated. But this is kind of like a tool I think can help to like really streamline all that stuff going forward, and then hopefully it becomes a big way to kind of like funnel people into Bitcoin in the future, also to make things a lot more efficient as well.
Yeah. You know how to make people bullish, man. This is that's craziest thing. Like it is again. Like, would you agree that it seems like we've hit, or maybe are approaching an inflection point? Like
as far as like
remember,
or
I would say more on like Lightning Network being feasible. Because remember, for the longest time, it was just vaporware.
18 months, all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I say definitely. I mean, you can say one event that undeniably helped towards that is just like Cash App's integration, basically. So all of a sudden now, boom, people around the world can get up to speed. I think also it's a very empowering for like a developer, because now it's no longer okay. Well, which wallet am I going to recommend them to? There's a bunch of different ones. Maybe the names are weird to them. It's okay. Well, at least you can start here. And then move on there and like get the non-custodial side beyond that. But definitely, I think there's definitely a lot of things that are just coming together now on the protocol level, the application level, companies, waking up to it. Also, people just recognizing globally, like, this is a thing you can use. So I remember, like, in the past, you'd go to something like HN and they're like, oh, Bitcoin sucks, silver, or but now it's like, okay, people at least know about Lightning and they're talking to someone intelligently about it. I don't need to comment. I just kind of like, oversee them. So I just see kind of like that mind share growing and people's understanding of like exactly the unique value proposition of the system itself, just, being actually properly decentralized, and also some of the abilities around, being able to like, get your node, plug it in, and then move on and actually enjoy the network.
Speaking of properly decentralized, do you think it stays that way? Because there's a lot of talk about. You think it stays properly decentralized as it scales?
I think so. I mean, I remember that was like a big thing at the beginning. Everyone's like, "Oh, this is going to be a mega hub. There's going to be 3 people, blah blah blah, whatever else." But I think the main thing there is that like the marginal, cost of like getting to the network is still relatively low, right? Okay, maybe you're not going to be an LN big and have 500 BTC or whatever else, but you yourself can join the network basically. Use it, send and receive basically. As long as like that marginal cost and that like barrier to entry is low, I think it will be right because now we are seeing some bigger nodes on the rise. But the thing is like if those nodes ever do something weird or kind of like people are sketch out on them, they're going to close channels out. They're gonna basically they're gonna route around that node basically. So I think you have that capability. Also, given that as a sender, you control your route entirely. If you want to just avoid someone because maybe they're a honeypot or whatever else, you can do so, right? So I think as long as we have that low barrier to entry, basically, it will continue to be like that. Maybe there will be certain corridors that are more specialized, certain activity. Maybe there's going to be a micropayments thing. Maybe there's going to be like a large one things work for us. So I think. Yeah, I'm not super worried about that in the end because I know like if someone wanted to start from scratch, basically they could make an entirely new network from scratch if they really wanted to. But then at the same time, you can kind of like make your own connections basically, and also given the ability to like optionally advertise channels versus not, I can also kind of like have something on the side, a bunch of unadvertised channels using Hop or whatever else that I used to route around other things. Maybe that's like my specialized secret backbone. It's like the the VIP exit or something like that. So I think because you have that capability to basically self-organize, recreate, and also select routes. It really has a lot of decentralized built into the main system.
Yeah, no, you made a very good point there in the beginning. The ability to have the option to exit from the node by closing a channel is a big, just natural incentive to operate in a
exactly
in a way that most of the network wants you to operate. So
yeah, and like channels are voluntary. That's the thing. It's like if I want to reject a channel for you, I can. I'm free to do so. If you want to reject it, you're free to do so as well too. So I think because we have that like self-organizing nature, and today it's not as if any one person was like, hey, open channels here, open channels here, open channels there. It just kind of happened. People
Mhm.
are reacting to market signals. Okay, there's a new exchange. Let me open my channel over here. Okay, I'm getting really good routing revenue. So because you kind of like have that self-organizing trait, which is very important for kind of these decentralized systems, I think we'll see that going forward. And I think that was a great thing from the start because, like, you can take us as the initial developers, we could have been a lot more prescriptive as far as like, okay, well, we're all going to open channels in the same way. We're going to make this very particular topology, whatever else. We're like, okay, well, no, just do it and let's see what happens. And seems to have worked pretty well from here.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to think like this new financial system that's budding. It's going to be run like I'm a media company and I have a Lightning node with
Yeah, you have no, yeah.
a material amount of Bitcoin in it, and we contribute. I mean, material for me in our company, but yeah, you're like, is that going to be a job in the future? The head of Lightning Network node management at a clothing
Yeah.
company or something like that.
Yeah, super good question. Yeah, I think, inevitably, yes, maybe it'll be like one layer removed where they don't necessarily manage all their servers or email, directly, but there's kind of like those individuals there. And I think, as things just pick up, like, now you can say you can make some money, but maybe you need to work a little more harder about it. But like, I think once we get that additional transactional, volume, ideally via or helping us maybe somewhat via things like Taro, things will get a lot realer based because then there'll be like kind of like more real revenue. There's going to be like more direct opportunity costs. I'd also say I think at this point, like, not many routers are really concerned as far as like their total profitability, right? Maybe they're spending a bunch of money on chain opening channels. Maybe they're doing a bunch of unnecessary rebalancing, whatever else. I think once people wake up to the fact that, okay, well, if I do dumb stuff, like I'm not necessarily gonna, walk away positive, then it becomes a little more competitive. I think we're already seeing that now. For example, like, or things like Looper as well too. Like, we're looking at things like the few rate distribution heat map across the network, basically to see what are the hotspots. I think people also starting to recognize like, the abilities to like modify your fee rate is a big thing to like kind of like signal demand and also like shape potential traffic flows as well too. So I think we're definitely very early in the game as far as optimization, automation. But I think in the future things get a lot more easier, and there will be kind of like these people that maybe have their edge they don't necessarily want to reveal. Similar to people doing some like arb trading or kind of like little AT thing, that have a little bit of edge. They give you the basic stuff, but not necessarily. So I think we're heading in that direction. And a few people already maybe that have certain edge, either because of like they've been there for a while, or maybe they just know when something's coming on, or they're kind of like some better tooling not really releasing. So definitely like an interesting competitive landscape. And I think that competition is what's going to drive it to be decentralized as well too. Because if you're really shitty or something like that, you have poor uptime, someone's going to take your spot. Maybe they're going to close out your channel and go with something else. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Gosh. I know you're extremely busy, man. We should wrap up here, but there are 6 bips for Taro, correct?
Correct.
Or associated with it.
Yes. Yeah.
Why bips? Why do we need bips for this?
Good question. So, very early on when we kind of like thought of like, the initial protocol and kind of like the idea or something we want to take a look at. I mean, I think it was very important to us that it wasn't seen as something that was like just a Lightning Labs thing, right? That we're just making this thing. We say, okay, well, we're doing this thing. You can come along or not. We didn't want to have like, they wanted to say, okay, well, let's like, we wanted to also make sure like this was seen as kind of like one of the main, defaults for doing, asset issuance and transfers as well too. So we kind of like went with kind of like a spec first approach. Okay, put out the BIP itself. Even in the background, we were like, shuffling around some other developers, getting some feedback, did a bunch of iterations in the background as well too. I think it was important for me to like, get that community level buy-in as well too, that they see as something that they think is interesting, they want to build upon as well too, not something that was like necessarily just like dropped from above and like, okay, we're doing this now, like so okay, well, this is what we're considering doing, check it out. So I think the bips definitely bring that because we've already got a bunch of really good feedback, and I think also people I remember like after the day after drop I had like 10 PRs to my BIP repo just doing things like typo, asking questions, whatever else. I think we really had that developer buy-in, which is really great for me as far as like validation, just knowing okay, like it's not, people aren't going to hate it completely. They're at least like someone invested in it as well. And I think that was kind of like the right path there. There's one more that is going to be on kind of like some PSBT stuff. I was just waiting to kind of like put that out because I wanted to like make sure a lot of stuff was a little more solid. But I think once we get that out, it's going to be a pretty solid set. And the cool thing about the pips as well is that like, there's one that's kind of like the core protocol, but there's also one that basically just addresses just the file format, just like, the Merkle tree, things like that as well too. So people can even like, work on implementations concurrently as well too, right? And, I'd say I think the point where the pips are fully finalized is when we actually get the test vectors in there and we're working on some updates, for example, the SMT one to get the test vectors and things like that. And I think this is really cool because now it's like, okay, well, it's not just our thing. It's kind of like a Bitcoin community thing. People can make implementations as well too. And I also definitely encourage people to like, make their own versions of it. And I'll also try to make it, compact enough where, they can do it and sit down and not be super bogged down as far as like some crazy complexities. Okay, well, I put a tree within the tree within the tree. And then, that's basically like, that's it in a nutshell. I reveal my tree to show you the tree that's actually a tree. Like,
Is this what Ryan meant when he was describing like multiverse and
Yes, some parts of that too. Yeah, so like it's a thing where there's something called kind of like a universe in it, right? And the idea is like, okay, well, like people need to be able to kind of like obtain these proofs, but then also be able to kind of like query them and also understand like where issuance is actually happening on the network itself, right? So you can say, let's say, someone like a Tether, issues like their own stablecoin, they'd kind of like maintain this quote unquote canonical universe basically that's like indexing into all the asset issuance transactions onto the chain itself, right? So now if I look at this root and say, okay, well, there's like one BTC or 1,000 BTC, that lets me know, okay, that's the total amount that's actually in circulation there, right? There's other things where I can do where it's like there's certain outputs designated where, so like for example, I have an on-chain event whenever they issue because they have to spend a particular output to update this universe contract as well too. That's one way you can do it. The other cool thing about it is that like because the SMT structure has like history independence, meaning okay, like if I have a set of keys or some assets and you have a set of them as well too, no matter what order we add them to retreat, we'll get the exact same root hash, right? This is really cool because all of a sudden I can like run the numbers myself. I can say, okay, well, let me gather everything that I actually have, make sure it adds up, and then boom, I can then also host that. So it's kind of like a combination of like a Git repo and a block explorer onto one, right? So in the other thing is like beyond just like tracking the initial asset issuance event, I can also track any other arbitrary event as well too. Because like the main key is keyed by like an out point basically. So anything that spends something on an out point and that has like a valid proof, I can put that in there. So almost like now I can basically like use this to basically create an explorer. That also gives me a proof for receipt of the validity of the data alongside of it as well too. And there's one other thing which is like it's called like a pocket universe right now. It's like let's say there's some cases where someone's like issuing an asset, maybe like, they're kind of like more reliant on the company, they want a little more control, or like the entity or whatever else. You can do something where you can basically kind of like, create a new virtual Bitcoin transaction graph in this other, universe basically, and then aggregate a bunch of transfers in that as well too, right? So let's say it's some like, individual or it's like a federated entity from Laos like that. So that I can then kind of like also scale the system by like, compressing a bunch of, transfers on the Taro layer into one transaction on the Bitcoin chain as well too. So that has some other cool, properties. I think in the future, like with a little bit more, capabilities, we can do something where maybe we'll allow people to like, fully exit from that. Maybe there be kind of a challenge type of thing, because that's something I think as well, where you can say, okay, well, I want that for kind of like scalability, but then I also want to be able to interact and like do like unilateral withdrawal, working on other things like that as well too. So I think that's another thing where it's like Taro likes to put a lot of these problems at the forefront of the protocol. Okay, how do I do validity? How do I verify supply? How do I like find my proofs? Right? It's not trying to hide any of that. Okay, well, this is how it is right here, and just make sure you understand the security implications, also kind of like how this thing's put together. Because otherwise, I think some protocols like maybe they like benefit off of some of that obscurity basically, and their obscurity maybe that's their back door, that's the rug, whatever else. Like no, let's just lay it all bare basically. And this is how everything works. And these are these things you need to worry about. And this is exactly what it looks like and what we're working on in the future as far as other future updates.
Yeah, so as a user, if you're going to engage with some of these assets, all right, here's the checklist of things I want to make sure that they have if they're issuing this to know that
exactly
the trade-offs are within my risk appetite.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we did pretty good job kind of like in creating all that stuff there. And now it's just a matter of like dropping this little code as far as showing people how to transfer it. I think also one very important thing we're focusing on is also kind of like generally the APIs in general, because to me I think APIs always kind of like make a big thing. If you have a shitty API, no one's going to use the thing. You have a great API, you basically onboard all other individuals as well too, and to make sure that things are very easy to use. So we're definitely working on that as well and getting a lot of feedback from companies that approached us even before we put anything out, as far as like feedback, the requirements, things like that as well too. So the code dropping soon. I think people maybe I think people appreciate like how compact certain versions of it aspect of it are. Whereas like the core thing itself is pretty compact, but I think people spend a lot more time on things like accounting, auditing, other like fancy UIs or whatever else. But as long as like I think that core is like short and sweet, basically, and understandable, I think that's just an edge as far as the simplicity of the protocol. So
sweet. How could anybody who's listening to this, who's so willing and motivated and capable, help you out with Taro?
Yeah, good question. So there's the BIP. Check it out. I posted on the Bitcoin Dev and Lightning Mailing list, kind of like some conversation there as well too. Now I'm accepting PRs to my own BIP repo, which is like github.com/bips. There's some PRs there, like like Taro, things like that as well. I also have an IRC channel now. That's just it's just me, but
sitting in there alone, like Steven Glansberg.
Exactly. It's pound Taro on Libera. And also, we have like a Slack as there as well too. But I think beyond that, like if you have any idea or you're wondering if something is possible, definitely just like shout me out, because I think that's also useful for me to kind of say, okay, like, what things are actually relevant protocol design wise, what do we need to work on as far as API, what things aren't well explained either. I think a bunch of feedback is basically, hey, can you explain this a little more better, which is also kind of like a big thing, because explainability goes a long way. If you don't really know how it works, or kind of like suspicious about it, like they're gonna default to no, which is like a very reasonable thing to do, right? Just given all like the crap in the space. So I think those definitely a few areas. Obviously, once we drop initial code and contributions there as far as like requirements or API or integration or something like that, would all push the thing on further.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you. When you originally posted to the mailing list, it was like one of those cool Bitcoin moments for me, because obviously people are posting to the mailing list quite a bit, especially this week and last week. But
yeah. The thing is, I was thinking about getting some graph of like Bitcoin developer activity over time, or like the mailing list. That's okay. That's drama. That's drama. Like
But
I should find that.
the day you dropped the Taro announcement on the newsletter, I actually had my email browser up and like saw it come in. I was like, oh, Olaoluwa's posting to the mailing list, and I read it.
Oh, you saw it in real time?
Yeah, and I was like, oh, this
is sick.
I read it immediately. I was like, this is really cool. Like, sweet. So I want to thank you, number one, for building everything you've built, helping push the world forward, helping push Bitcoin forward. And then, this is extremely cool, Taro specifically. And this is episode 326. I can't believe it took us that long to get you on the show, but I'm very happy.
Yeah, there were some like near misses in the past, I remember, but we made it happen.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, man. Again, keep crushing it, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Cool. Right. No, thanks for the opportunity, and just all generally the feedback as well too. It's all very just encouraging and just energizing, as well. So.
Yeah. Well, your man doesn't seem like you need any more energy. So. All right, that's all we got today.